This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, well, a very good evening to you all. Thank you for coming along this slightly grim and overcast Thursday afternoon. It's my great pleasure. I'm Dr. David Cantor of the Refugee Law Initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for a talk that I think has been something of a high point and certainly highly anticipated during the course of the year. Many of our topics are very technical during the course of seminars looking at construction terms, and we sometimes forget to step back and look more broadly at refugee law and its implications from a theoretical standpoint. For that reason, we're extremely privileged this evening to have with us Professor Patricia Tuitt of Birkbeck College at the University of London, known to you, I suspect, also as the Dean of the Law School of Birkbeck. Patricia has been working on asylum and refugee issues for, I'm not sure how many years, certainly a good number of years. What I can say is that in terms of her publications, they've always been seminal and hard-hitting. And during the course of the week, in advertising this series, we've had a number of email correspondence from people around the world asking if this podcast will be put on the web, because there is a great deal of interest in what Patricia Tuitt has to say on the direction of refugee law. And her theory on this, I think, is pretty much the leading body of work that exists. Alongside her book on race, law and resistance, which feeds into her work on critical race theory, she's written widely on the issue of forced migration and post-coloniality. And for that reason, tonight's topic is very much welcomed by the Refugee Law Initiative. I should say that amongst the seminal works is also perhaps the first book I ever read on refugee law theory, False Images, the Law's Construction of the Refugee, probably a classic of the field by now. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Patricia Tuitt to deliver her paper. After her paper, you'll have the chance to ask questions or to make comments, and once the seminar's finished, you're very welcome to come up and speak with her. If you could just please make sure that the mobile phones are switched off, just as a matter of courtesy, and I should remind myself to do that as well. Without further ado, in that case, I'll hand over to Patricia Tuitt for her seminar on refugees, law and post-colonial theory.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me at the back? Can I begin first by thanking David and Margarita for their invitation to this series? I'd also like to begin with an apology because unfortunately Birkbeck Law School, all of Birkbeck, teaches most of its programs in the evening. It is for students who are studying or otherwise engaged during the day. The result of that, of course, has been that I've not been able to attend this series myself, and I would like to, and I'm sure I've missed a great deal. So I do apologise for that. It certainly isn't indifference, it's just that I'm teaching elsewhere, usually on a Thursday evening. Okay, so although I'm working from a relatively short document here, I am taking things from various strands of work. So I do hope this is going to be a fairly coherent presentation, but forgive me if there are sort of gaps in the conceptual framework, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up any gaps or omissions within the questions. Any other hesitation may be also because I'm finding it quite difficult to see my written text. The light's not brilliant here, so if there's any other pause, it's probably for me to try and see what I have in front of me. So my talk today then is based upon a forthcoming chapter in a collection of works on asylum and immigration, but that chapter itself sits within a larger body of work, mainly on the constituting of the European Union. So that's my most recent work over the last 3 to 4 years has been around the European Union, how it developed, and most importantly, what is the event or other thing that gives it its constitutive force, that has allowed the European Union to come into being. The particular chapter that I'm working from is titled The Modern Refugee in the Postmodern Europe. The Modern Refugee in the Postmodern Europe. And by way of introduction, I shall dwell upon this title just for a little while in the hope of providing some, I think, necessary context, because when you're trying to present a piece that's part of a larger work, of course, much of the particular piece is dependent on the framework elsewhere, and therefore it may be less clear and coherent without some context. So let's say something about the title. And the title, I think, implies at least two claims, which are crucial to an understanding of my larger project. The first is that the yet incomplete progress in Europe from the nation-state form to the European Union, that process, which is still unfolding, represents an important temporal and spatial transition. So the first claim in the title is that the process from the Europe of nation states to the European Union is an important transition in both spatial and temporal terms. And for reasons that I hope will become apparent by the end of the talk at least, I have insisted throughout my work on characterizing this transition as one from the modern world, characterized by the nation-state form in particular, of the nation-state form of political existence, the modern world, the transition from the modern world towards some postmodern or post-national frame. Okay, so I insist on, for the purposes of this work, on this notion of a transition from the modern world, characterized by many things, but particularly by the nation-state form of political existence towards some postmodern or post-national frame of organisation. And I do insist on this, even though, of course, I acknowledge the difficulties of this form of periodisation, but I hope that it will become apparent to why I think these are useful ways of thinking about the European Union. So that's the first part that I think is implied in the title. Not the title of this talk, but the title of the work this talk is based on, The Modern Refugee in the Postmodern Europe. The second claim, and this second claim relates to the core of the argument I want to present today, is that the refugee, and when I talk of the refugee, I'm talking of the sociological phenomenon and the legal term of art, but perhaps with some emphasis on the legal term of art. The refugee is modern, and thus out of time and out of place within the new Europe. So that the other aspect implied in the title is that the refugee is modern, not postmodern, in using those disputed concepts, and therefore, importantly, is out of time and out of place within the new Europe. What is not implied in the title, but what also underpins the whole of the work, the larger work, and I think has to be stated here, is that the movement of Europe to the European Union was a design, it's a project, it is precisely a project of invention, it's an effort, if you like. There's nothing natural about it, obviously you will all accept that, it is an effort. And that just as Europe is made to be postmodern, so too the refugee is made to be modern. So this is, the argument is that this refugee that I'm talking of as modern is also an invention. The refugee is made to be modern within a postmodern polity. Made to remain modern, made to be out of time, and therefore to sit uncomfortably within the new Europe. So My general question, I suppose, is to try to ask myself what is the big question that's posed in this project, concerns the question of how, what I will, for convenience, call the old modern Europe, how it transformed itself, how it pushed itself forward in time, and how it revolutionized itself. So the question is, how did it get to the new stage, if one accepts that there has been this transition? How did it become what at least used to be thought of as a deterritorialized polity without historical precedent? There may be changes in people's views of the European Union as a result of recent things, but that's certainly the dominant positioning of the European Union, at least in terms of certain legal scholarship. But more importantly, perhaps, my question is what is left behind in this process of a transition? What is left behind in this process of transition? More pertinently, perhaps, what does that remainder do in relation to the whole? Why is it important, perhaps, for Europe to be postmodern, to have something remaining within the European polity that can be seen to be out of place and out of time? And in my presentation, that would be the refugee. How are individuals or groups made to feel out of time? Now, I ask these questions in relation to the refugee within the European Union, but of course the question is most often posed, or these questions, or these kinds of questions, are most often posed in relation to the constituting of the modern world, the nation state. There's the question about who's left behind, why is it important to create something that is out of time and out of frame, is often posed in relation to the various wars and conquests, and most particularly those colonial acquisitions or inventions that brought about new legal and political entities and created also the remnant, the outsider. So this larger question then is, of course, the question, I think, of post-colonial theory or inquiry. The question that is posed usually in relation to the invention of other legal entities is one that is a concern of post-colonial theory or inquiry, within which broad framework I would locate some of my recent work. The question has, for example, been posed time and again in relation to the famous Marbo and Queensland case. I guess most people, or a lot of people at least working in law, would have heard of that case. It's a case that is a central locus of critique for a lot of post-colonial theory. And that case concerned the political status and legal rights of the indigenous inhabitants of the Murray Islands in the state of Queensland when Australia asserted sovereignty. And the indigenous inhabitants were their rights were effectively raised by the operation of the legal myth of discovery, whereby lands that were in occupation by indigenous groups could be deemed a terra nullius, that's sort of an empty space, de facto desert, uninhabited, and as a consequence of that designation, open to seizure by European settlers. The Marbo is an example, just one example, of the many instances where groups of individuals are presented as chaotic, as static, as being backward, as being, I quote from Marbo, without a sovereign, without laws, and primitive in their social organisation. In this context, in the context of Australia's assertion, as being pre-modern in a modern world. But they are just one example of the creation, if you like, or the invention of a new polity and the simultaneous invention of groups who are positioned as being out of time and out of frame. And it is that history and that theorising of that history, perhaps more pertinently, that I've tried to bring to bear to my analysis of the European Union and the position of the refugee within the European Union in particular. So I think I should probably say something a little bit more about that larger work and then hone in on the key argument. So briefly then, the larger work essentially explores the extent to which scholarship which examines the operation of law in the creation of the colonies and in the emergence of post-colonial societies, that is post-colonial legal theory, the extent to which that legal theory can be deployed in an effort to understand both the historical development of the European Union and its current form and character. Notwithstanding its current instability, the European Union is, I think, one of the most significant of legal and political entities to have emerged since the second half of the 20th century. As such, the question through what set of conditions, imperatives, ideologies and structures it derives its force and legitimacy is one of enduring interest among legal scholars as well as political theorists, who ask, for example, whether the European Union is merely an extension of the nation-state form, or does it gesture towards a form of federal dispensation? Is it instead, and I think this is the popular, or was the popular view, an entity without historical precedent in relation to which new forms or new theories of political formation and governance need to be fashioned? So those kinds of questions, and it's within that frame of questioning that I position myself also. And again, despite the present crisis, which as well as exposing the weakness of monetary union, does recall to mind the national rivalries of the old order of nation states, I think it's true to say that legal scholars more often advance the European Union as a true political invention, as something that has come into being in a way that is not easily able to be assimilated with other forms of other polities, something that has come into being absent revolution, conquest, or other familiar form of constitutional settlement, a political community structured from positive legal norms and the activities of political and legal elites, for example. I'm not suggesting that's the only way the European Union is conceived. Indeed, there are some important critical texts that take different views, but I think that is a sort of popular view. And to some extent, I do see it as an invention, as being very different. But what I'm arguing is that there's a process in which polities emerge that are invented and that appear novel, but precisely because of a particular mode of constituting, but that general mode of constitution is not novel. So in enlightening upon post-colonial theory as the key lens through which to examine the nature of the European Union, I don't dismiss the value of more conventional frames of reference. However, the invention of the colony is a particular feature of the histories of many states that now form part of the European Union. And that period of European history produced institutional forms, structures, and norms of governance, the very tools from which political entities are invented, maintained, and refined, which cannot, I would suggest, be said to have entirely fallen into disuse during the time of the early fashioning of the European Union. And what I tried to do then in the larger project is to take key legal innovations of the colonial period and demonstrate, to some extent, hopefully successfully, how they have also operated in the development of the European Union, and in their operation have produced what are in fact quite familiar legal and political forms which paradoxically appear novel. So that is these colonial techniques are used to invent something that is in fact not as unfamiliar in its process of invention, but which paradoxically appears novel. So the first in this is the recognition that the principal means through which colonial sovereigns were created was through the migration and settlement of European peoples in lands to which they were not native or domicile. So the importance of migration and settlement in the invention of the new is the first element of the development of the European Union that I try to interrogate in that. So one part of the project attempts to trace continuities and discontinuities between this process of colonial acquisition and the processes in which the European Union was formed, looking at the free movement provisions in particular. And in this part, I'm very much informed by Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth, and the argument contained in that work that all new political entities, in his view, are created through some mode of land seizure. So there is the first part is to look at the importance of migration in the European Union. And I can, of course, elaborate some of this if necessary in the discussion, because I appreciate that some of these assertions would need to be analysed a bit further, and I don't have the space to do so. So the second part fixes upon one very important legal doctrine developed during the colonial era, and one that is an important locus of criticism for scholars working in the field of post-colonial legal theory, and that is the doctrine of, or fiction of Terra nullius that was talked about in the context of the Marbo decision. Relating that concept to the free movement principle, I argue that the old Europe, the old European space, had to be conceived as a figuratively empty space, to be imagined as empty, and I'll explain how, before Europe could propel itself into what is now the European Union. So that importance of the presentation or the imagination of something that you want to change as being empty and ripe for change through migration usually is an important feature of the colonial shift, and I again try to examine the extent to which one might see that operating in the construction of the EU. But the final segment of the argument is the core of this presentation, which says that not least of the lessons learned from the colonial past, in inverted commas, is that individuals or groups that refuse to be modern, or to be more accurately, who are denied the opportunity to be modern, are dispossessed in numerous ways. And of course this is Marbo exactly. This is the Miriam people, I think they were called, of Marbo, who could not be modern. They were deemed to be without laws and primitive in their social organisation. Of course, the judges in Marbo say that was never true, of course. There was a form of organisation, a form of laws and so on, but they were not allowed to be modern. These are dispossessed in numerous ways, suffering, of course, in the context of the colonies, land or losses of other legal entitlements. And again, it's against this background history and the theorising of that history that I explore the refugee in the European Union. The refugee seemingly stubbornly attached to the old nation-state form, and that's what I mean when I say modern, seemingly at odds with the postmodern ambitions of the European Union. Whereas indigenous groups in colonial times were disavowed because they were deemed to be pre-modern in the modern world, the refugee, the argument is the modern subject living within an avowedly post-modern European Union. So that brings us then to the point and a more detailed discussion about the refugee in an effort to try and substantiate some part of that claim. So in the space of time allotted, I can't do justice to the argument, or indeed to the post-colonial theories and histories that inform it. But I want to structure the remainder of the presentation in order to try and make this argument around the last segment, which is the refugee is the person who has to be disavowed for the European Union eventually to enter the stages of history as a real invention in that sense. And I want to try and address that in three parts. The first part addresses the question I guess you're all asking, is in what sense am I saying that the refugee is modern? And essentially what I'm arguing is that the refugee has been fixed within European Union, within the frame of a modernist conception of international law, and is allowed to be little else. And I want to try and think of the consequences of that fixing of the refugee within the European Union. Right, so that's the first part. And I'm going to do that to talk about the modernism, if you like, of the refugee, mainly through an exploration of how the refugee is treated within theoretical and philosophical discourses, which I think is possibly more interesting and less familiar perhaps to this audience than the other way in which I can make the argument simply by talking about the state-centred nature of the refugee concept, which I think is an argument you will all be familiar with. So that's the first part. Second, I'll say something, if necessary, again briefly, to substantiate the claim that the EU is generally thought of as a postmodern legal and political invention, but importantly, to look at the importance of the exercise of free movement in the process of inventing the European Union. I won't spend as long on that because I think that takes us into all different kinds of terrain which touches on the broader project and which perhaps it goes a bit beyond people's interest in asylum. And then I'll conclude by coming back to the title of the essay and examining the constitutive form of this combining of the modern refugee and the postmodern Europe. In other words, in the final section, I want to, in a sense, try and make the case, which is why is it important to have the modern in the postmodern, in the same way that it's been important, constitutively, I mean, important to have the pre-modern in the modern in the old colonial point. What is the function, to put it perhaps more simply, what is the function of the refugee in the constituting of Europe? What's the function of the refugee being fixed within this frame? So, I'll answer the first point then. The starting point for most philosophical inquiries into the refugee condition usually begins, I think, fittingly with Hannah Arendt, and specifically her writing on the refugee condition in an essay towards the end of the origins of totalitarianism. I don't know if people know this work. I'm not going to say much about it anyway, but I'll say enough for those of you who may not know. In this, she argued that the refugee is the figure that brings to us knowledge of the essential illusion that's at the centre of international human rights, of the international human rights regime, a regime that purports to attach rights to the human, to man's naked existence, as she puts it, but fails the only human, the refugee, who can occupy that position. So we talk about human rights as if they're rights that attaches to the individual, the human being, but we see how false that is when we confront the refugee, because the refugee, being outside the political community, is the person who in her terms is rightless, is not just lacking rights, or whose rights have not just been abused or disregarded, but who, in her terms, lacks the right to have rights. So once the political community is confronted with the naked human being, the person divorced from political community, detached from any frame, and of course in the context of Hannah Arendt, she talked of the nation state, then we saw how that human rights simply couldn't protect that refugee, and that in fact human rights are not rights that attach to a person's naked existence, but they require some political form, arguably the state form, but some political form to bring them into being. Apologies if that was a bit of a hash of Arendt's argument, but that is essentially her point. And the crucial point for our purposes is that she uses the refugee to show just how fragile is this notion of human rights. And the refugee brings that knowledge of the essential of the disconnect between the human and rights to our consciousness. More recently, Giorgio Agamben has taken up Arendt's thesis and made pretty much a career of it, indeed, of a relatively short chapter where his work is very much about how one might begin to think about political community differently, I mean radically differently, so radically that it's impossible in some sense to set his philosophy within any sort of existent frame or even any imaginable frame in that sense. But he in his work that attempts to rethink political community, he also takes the fate of the refugee, showing, as he claims Arendt did, that the refugee is the figure, I'm quoting, that signals the concept, radical crisis, the concept of the nation state. Now he concedes in his reading of Arendt's work that the origins of totalitarianism leaves open the question of whether the nation state form is an indispensable form of theorizing. So she's not clear on that point, although of course she's working in the context of the nation state. But for many other theoretical accounts of the refugee, the state form is an unavoidable locus of criticism and analysis. My point being that within much of philosophy and theory that is influential in relation to the refugee's association with the state form is a link that almost is impossible to separate, and I'll come back to what's significant about that. So the state form is an unavoidable locus of criticism and analysis, although more contemporary accounts present the refugee as the figure that most emphatically calls into question the efficacy as well as the ethics of the state form and points towards a new political consciousness. For example, Giorgio Agamben, returning back to Agamben, he, in using the refugee, argues that the refugee points us to a form of political community that, however else his conception may be unclear or vague, is undoubtedly a post-national consciousness. So it is one in which whatever a political community allows, it's not conditional upon a notion of the nation state. It is in fact the trinity of state, territory and identity that the refugee condition indicts for all its exclusionary violence that he wants to see dissolved. And just to give you an indicative quote, so that his theory is not entirely destroyed by my presentation, he says, and I quote, "The concept of the refugee and the figure of the life the concept represents must be resolutely separated from the concept of the rights of man, of human rights, and we must seriously consider Arendt's claim that the fates of human rights and the nation-state are bound together such that the decline and crisis of the one necessarily implies the end of the other. The refugee must be considered for what he is, nothing less than a limit concept that radically calls into question the fundamental categories of the nation-state form, the birth nation to the man-citizen link, and thereby makes it possible to clear the way for a long overdue renewal of categories." I appreciate that I read this fairly quickly, but this is the presentation of the refugee for whom the nation-state is important, but precisely as a means of challenging the state form. Now, of course, one argument is that if you take the Arendtian and Agamben position, then the refugee is precisely not one. I mean, it would, on one analysis, be, I think, a quite formidable objection to my claim that the refugee is modern, because it is precisely, on one analysis, the refugee who invites the end of the nation-state and the beginning of something new, of which the European Union might be that something, although I think we probably all agree that it isn't. But when you delve further into Agamben's writing, and I think the same applies to Arendt to a great extent, although she's less detailed on the conception of refugee that she deploys. The idea of, or the depiction of the refugee that is behind this ambitious renewal is very much the juridical concept of refugee. So in Agamben's work, and I've made this point in another published work, it does not take much more than a fairly cursory reading of Agamben's text to discern that the refugee he alludes to in his argument is that seemingly ineradicable legal term of art. He makes particular reference to the refugee of the Lands Bureau, or the refugee of the Intergovernmental Committee, and eventually to the UN International Refugee Organization. So at the same time that he's trying to present a figure that could step away from the nation-state or allow us to think beyond the nation-state, his conception of refugee is that very blunt juridical category. And one thing I'm sure I don't need to say in relation to this audience is that that juridical category is very much a state-centered conception of human rights. What I've tried to establish in the larger work is that in most, even the most radical philosophical treatment of the refugee, the juridical concept of refugee tends to haunt all ideas about the refugee. And of course, this may be different, perhaps if I looked at theoretical works outside of the European tradition. It may be that my lens needs to be expanded. But it is very much still the juridical concept of the refugee that seems to hold a preeminent position within theory, but also, as I was going to say, within the European Union. So significant is that concept of the European Union, of the refugee, the concept that's really been designed or fixed within the convention, that I think it's even fairly compelling for a relatively acute political observer such as Agamben. What I want to try and show is that the idea of the refugee as a human rights category created a state-centered human rights category as modern in that concept is important in the European Union's effort to achieve revolution or transition. And what I also want to add to that in terms of the idea about modernism is that when in talking about the refugee as a modernist conception of human rights, I also want to just emphasize again something I don't think I need to elaborate here, is that human rights themselves are both creations and creators of modernity. And I'm quoting from Costas Desinas here, in his longer work on the end of human rights. It's impossible, arguably, to think in terms of human rights without thinking about a species of rights that were characteristic of the modern world. And another point of the argument around the European Union, I do try to show how what is important in the discussions about the European Union is the presentation of the Union and of its citizens, and that doesn't include the refugee, as in a sense transcending that era of fundamental rights, in the sense that civil and political rights are no longer the most important rights that are pursued within the European Union, not because civil and political rights are not significant, but because of the suggestion that within the European space, one is safe from, on the whole, from abuses of those rights. In other words, the pursuit of civil and political rights is something that belongs to a different time, and that pursuit is evident in the refugee, but within the European Union, other citizens are pursuing different kinds of rights because those civil and political rights are not salient within the internal sphere. I'll try and unpack that argument if necessary at some point, because I appreciate I'm becoming confused. Okay, so by all means ask me for further elaboration of this point about the modern. So modern in the sense that to summarize, that the refugee and the nation state are inextricably tied in, not just in the philosophical imagining, but that's what I've tried to focus on in my example, but also in the way in which the legal construct of asylum asylum and refugee has been developed. And the question that remains is what is the significance of that construct within the development of the European Union. How long do I have? I'm trying to count.
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So the modern refugee, the postmodern Europe. Do I need to say, I suspect I do need, if only briefly, to say something to explain why I would insist on using the term postmodern in relation to the European Union. It is as I said at the introduction, it is the claim within the European Union, and I think the claim that has a certain that can be substantiated to a certain degree, that the European Union represents a significant transition from the old arrangement of nation states. Now, whether you characterize that as postmodern or not is in a sense immaterial. It is important in my construction because of the significance of the contrast between the European Union and the refugee. What I think is less in dispute is the idea that the European Union is characterized by a number of legal innovations in particular that are not easily found in other contexts. So the most familiar that people speak of is the doctrine of direct effect, which makes nationals of member states direct subjects of European law. But other legal innovations that many fairly leading scholars on European law have been persuaded by these changes to characterize the European Union as effectively a European Union without a legal and political form without historical precedent. There are many examples of that I won't go through all the evidence of that positioning of the European Union, but there's a great deal of scholarship that talks about the European Union as a sui generis legal community, as something without historical precedent. And indeed, the development of the Union does at first sight appear to suggest the coming into being of a maverick form amongst other models of political organisation. In just over half a century, previously independent states have exchanged, arguably, sovereign power over certain defined spheres of operation for the benefits, and as we see, the occasional telling disadvantages of a largely unregulated globalised market in the primary modes of production. And as well, such states embrace the goals of achieving increasingly flat forms of social and political enfranchisement and more generic organisation of broad citizenship entitlements. It's hard to see how such immense shifts, and there have been some fairly immense shifts, could have come about without an unprecedented movement in tools and conceptualizations of social and political ordering. So I do accept that the European Union is not just an extension of the nation state, that I would not argue, and does present itself as something new. But what I do argue is that this discovery of something new, this seeming invention, this form of novelty, is not itself unusual, particularly if we think within a post-colonial frame. What makes the European Union appear novel, then, is that which has inaugurated other political inventions, made other new sovereigns or formal legal entities, and that is essentially a process of migration and settlement of persons into a space deemed to be figuratively empty and thus open for exploration. According to the political theorist Carl Schmitt, discovery, the intense exploration of territory, is not a timeless, universal and normative concept. It's just something that's limited and was bound to a particular historical and situation, and that is a situation we call the age of discovery. But I think it should be asked through what means, other than by placing the discovery within a broader normative framework, that one can account for the political community that still today, when deemed to have reached the limits of its economic and social efficacy, is imagined as waste or desolate, and as a consequence of that imagining, open to radical alteration. I mean, that is the feature of the colonial that I play with, the idea that when something is seen to have reached its limits, economically, politically, socially, then it can be, then it is imagined as empty and open to radical alteration. The European Union, still in the process of emergence from the old order of nation states, is, I would suggest, the case in point. Like so many legal entities that have preceded it, it is being settled by the migration of people and by the free movement of other factors of production. And again, like so many legal entities that have come before it, the European Union, survives, and I would say even thrives, on a discursive terrain which places emphasis on the failings of the old, of the nation state. So it is important to the emergence of the European Union to emphasize constantly the failings of the old state. The presentation of the nation state form as I'm quoting from Peter Fitzpatrick here, as the savage nation of warlike and divisive assertion paved the way for the emergence of the European Union. To put it another way, the old modern Europe had to be conceived as thoroughly bankrupt before it could be appropriated to the resolutely post-national and post-modern aims of European integration. And if I had time, I would say a little bit more about how the idea of the old bankrupt Europe and the process in which that bankrupt space can be appropriated partly through the movement of people, how that could work with Schmidt's argument that all political communities begin with some kind of land appropriation. But I want to stay with, to conclude, I want to stay with the idea of the necessity of the perception of the old nation state as being bankrupt and primitive in its social organisation. I'm using these terms deliberately, so I'm sure you see, in order to bring it in relation to the refugee. So in common with all sovereign entities that have emerged in any epoch in history, the European Union will define itself through a radical break with what came before it. The European Union is a legal and political community that has been fashioned from previously governed and extensively populated territories of Europe, and it can only truly enter history when it has transcended not merely the political, economic and social structures that are characteristic of the old order of Europe, but when, importantly, it has surpassed or overboard those individuals or groups who are perceived as uniquely representing that old order. As so many accounts of the legal nature of the European Union have convincingly argued, the European Union is not a political community born of the old modern world from which the nation-state form was produced, but rather it is an entity that is ambitiously post-national, one that gestures towards a post-modern future. Thus, the European Union is an entity that is necessarily in tension with the putatively modern world of the nation-state. Conventional accounts of the emergence of the European Union are very faithful in depicting the process of its emergence in tension with the old nation-state. That is not in any sense controversial. Most, even textbook accounts, focus on the tensions between the European Union and the nation-state form. But there, I think most accounts stop. To complete the description and analysis of the European Union's emergence onto the status of the world, there must be equally faithful accounts of its emergence in tension with individuals or groups made to symbolise the old nation-state form, and more generally, made to symbolise the modern world within which that form developed. And it is here that controversially, and perhaps even counterintuitively, I argue that the refugee is that symbol of the old order that the European Union seeks to transcend. Thus, I would say the repudiation of the refugee as a legal and sociological construct is the act that signals also the transcendence of the nation-state. I'm not going to go as far as to argue that the refugee exclusively symbolises the old order, because I know there are other accounts that are as compelling, more compelling, that talk about other symbols of things that are in tension with the European Union. So I don't want to ignore other groups that have been sacrificed to the ambitions of the European Union, the economic migrant, the resident non-national, and so on. But in my account, I would say that the refugee is, if not the sole signifier, then at least the principal signifier of the bankrupt old order of Europe. So New Europe, as many argue, arose to transcend the nation-state, to recover from the economic and political bankruptcy of the old order of Europe. There is, as I've said earlier, frequent emphasis on the badness of nation. But what is important is that that emphasis on what is bad about the old, about any state that preceded a new legal and political order, is not at all unique to the European Union and discourses around the European Union, but is a discernible feature of discussions around the emergence of other sovereign entities at different times. In other words, if one looks at a history, particularly around the colonial history, the presentation of other forms of political being as being bankrupt or savage or otherwise inadequate seem to be a constant refrain in these discourses, that the emergence of sovereign powers, the presentation of alternative ways of being as being bad, savage or warlike seems to be essential. So entirely in keeping with the history of sovereign emergence, the European Union could not have emerged other than against the backdrop of chaos and disorder. The project of European integration could only move forward on the basis of a determined looking back upon a savage wasteland in need of modernisation. And it is its emergence from within a discursive terrain that juxtaposes the savage and the civil, that is the good post-nation union within the bad against the bad nation state, that I suggest indicates that the European Union's history is not as distinct from other histories of the emergence of a legal and political entity. Within this, the refugee is significant, and I'm moving forward to explain why I think that the refugee is important. Yes, when we talk of the vicious circle of violence, I'm quoting, that followed the sovereign state, or of the old order that held calamitous political structures, or of the state form that was immersed in a repetitive pattern of bloody conflict, these are all things that have been said about the nation state, we see the grounds on which the European Union asserts its identity. But it is a human subject that must make concrete this depiction of a vicious circle of violence. To go back to my earlier example about the Marburg case, it was the Miriam people who were who made concrete the pre-modern order that the new Australian sovereign was to transcend. It is a human subject on which is embodied the conflicts that the new order seeks to bury and transcend. The evocative descriptions of the development of the European Union from the long road of travel through the nation state have no currency as mere words on the page, but only as a reference to a concrete someone. The calamitous structures of the old order of Europe can only be really understood, experienced through the embodiment of chaos or crisis in someone. And it is in this context that I think that the refugee is significant. Part of this discussion has been taken up by others who think about Europe's others, that the way Europe asserts itself against an excluded others. And again, in a sense, I think I'm pushing this particular trajectory of inquiry to its limit, with the refugee being more than one of a number of non-Europeans against which a default definition of Europe is being constructed, but as the principal signifier of the bankrupt order. In this regard, then, it is surely instructive that the only refugee who can come to the European Union secure in the knowledge that a safe haven exists has been endowed with all the negative attributes of the old European order. It is the convention refugee, the refugee who suffers persecution on account of her or his nationality, religion, race, social group membership or political opinion. It is the refugee who is accorded the reluctant hospitality of member states. So it is the refugee who represents the modern human rights concept, the person who is challenged because of their civil and political being, who is essentially within the European, welcomed within the European Union. And as critics of the asylum regime have consistently argued, these are not the forms of injury characteristic of all contemporary refugee-producing phenomenon. But the preeminence of the Geneva Convention still remains, and what remains also, what inheres in the concept of refugeehood as understood within the European Union, are those forms of injury for which the nation-state is famed. So in that sense, being endowed with the negative attributes of the nation-state, the refugee is necessary to the European Union, but necessary only insofar as she operates to remind us of the chaos that threatens if the new order of the postmodern and post-national European Union is not fully embraced. So that the bankrupt condition of the nation-state and the refugee are inextricably linked. I think I need to end here, but I just again want to end, and I'll elaborate this a little more when perhaps in the questions, that what is interesting about the refugee within the European Union is that there is a very strong, I think, a sense in which you have a group who are struggling fairly regressively to secure fundamental rights, first-generation rights, which others within the European Union, citizens of the European Union, almost relegate into a different time. Interestingly, is in looking at the rights that the refugee pursues within the European Union as against the rights that Union citizens are pursuing, creates that sense of a modern citizen, or a modern citizen against something less modern or less postmodern, depending on one's periodizations. Okay. I am aware that that was a rather ragged ending, but I was also running out of time, so thank you very much. And I won't try and summarise the book in 30 minutes again.
Well, you did it very well, so you might be called on to do so again. Thanks very much for what was a clear and I think thought-provoking presentation. As I said, for those of you who maybe came in a little later, we often have the opportunity in these seminar series to think about legal technicalities, but to take a step back and think about the refugee in a much broader spread is an opportunity that we really relish, and it's really great to have Patricia's paper as part of the series. I'm going to leave the floor open for questions or comments, but I thought I might lead off whilst you're thinking on yours with one of my own. A nice gentleman, absolutely, getting into the spirit. You talk obviously about Europe, and Europe really is, as we've seen throughout this seminar series, and actually in another seminar series which is going on at Oxford about refugee law, which I equally would recommend to you, on EU asylum law, that Europe really is at the heart of a lot of developments on international refugee law in today's world. It's a very interesting project by one of our speakers last year, Helen Lambert, which looks at the influence of EU, European refugee law in other parts of the world. Many other parts of the world look at Europe as a model, particularly in this field. It occurred to me though, if one thinks about other regional organisations, for example, like the Organisation of African Unity, which created its own refugee convention back in 1967, 69, correct me? 69. The refugee there takes on a rather different figure. I mean, it's a refugee who's fleeing from mass persecutions, generalised violence, etc. Does the refugee there perform a similar kind of significance within your theory, or is Europe really trying to signify itself as something very different from what perhaps the African Union was using that as a signifier for?
Okay.
Or are we talking about a different sort of process? The African Union's not using that as a signifier, but really as a stopgap to some very difficult humanitarian problems. How far does the ignorance extend?
Well, I think the first thing to say in response to that is that I'm very aware that my research and on the refugee and my understanding of the refugee is very much confined to the refugee in Europe and more recently within the European Union. And I accept the limitations of that. So certainly I would welcome comments from the audience who may have a different understanding of how the refugees thought about within other regions. As far as the Organisation of the African Unity definition of refugee, the extent to which I've tended to think about all the competing definitions of the refugees precisely within the frame that I presented, which is there are different ways of thinking about the refugee. Why are we so attached to a notion of refugee that seems to be so state-centered, that is, and focused on first-generation civil and political rights? So in a sense, the analysis of competing definitions of the refugee, of which the Organisation of African Unity Convention is but one, is really to say that if you're confronted with the sociological phenomenon of refugee, then you are looking at something that is very different from the refugee as designed within the Convention. That's not a novel claim, and that's something that refugee practitioners as well as refugee scholars have been arguing for a long time. And I've certainly argued made the sort of same analysis from a much more doctrinal point of view in the False Images book. So I think I've then become fascinated with why. And of course, I accept that this may be simply saying that you cannot capture within a legal definition the phenomenon of a refugee. The arguments are that this is a way of containing the refugee phenomenon and all of those, and I think those are all valid arguments. But what I have been interested in is to think about what, in a constitutive sense, that defining of the refugee does in the context of the European Union that is still struggling for an identity. So yes, I mean, whether the refugee figures in other contexts as the other, to put it one way, in the context of a different frame of political organisation, is something I wouldn't be able to argue, but I'd be certainly interested in looking at some of Helene's work in that regard. Does that answer, partly answer?
Certainly does, yes. I'm going to open it to the floor, so if anybody's got comments, questions, please feel free to put them forward. Yes?
No problem at all with the kind of register that you were discussing these things, no problem at all. What I kind of didn't follow the argument through was when you started to say that refugee norms, human rights, they're not post-national too. Because it seems to me, once you introduce that kind of way of thinking, well, why aren't these promises and outcomes by which foreigners are taken in, allowed to stay, given treatment? Why are they not post-national too? I mean, there is somewhere there denial of there's somewhere there a recognition of the failure of the relationship between the first state, the state of origin, and the foreigner. Yeah. The inadequacy of the relationship. So so it's why is the refugee modern? I think this is what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think that is the most, for me, the most challenging part of the argument. Can I ask? I'll answer the sort of more technical side of the question first, in the sense of how does one analyse the norms that allow an asylum seeker to gain refugee status in another context, and given that that's precisely enabling an individual to separate, or who is separated from their nation state to claim another identity, if you like, or existence, then that can be thought of as post-national. I think I will agree that I'm not suggesting that those norms are not post-national in the sense that there is some acceptance of a disturbance in the connection between the asylum seeker and their place of domicile or nationality in that context. But what is modern, if you like, is precisely the context within which that is allowed, within which that process is enabled, and I think that's really what I understood Hannah Arendt to be saying, which is that without some fairly concrete idea of a sort of territorially bound nation state, that process of exchange it wouldn't work. So that's the first. But also I think that what is modern about, or what I'm arguing is modern about that process, and why I argue that the refugee is modern, is that identity of the refugee, which is the sort of identity that is constructed from a human rights frame that privileges the civil and political, is very much a modern conception of rights, which I think, if we think of different ways of conceiving of the refugee, is limited in terms of how one might conceive of the refugee. So it's rather the sense that the refugee cannot be anything other than, or the privileged refugee cannot be anything other than the refugee who has lost his identity with his, or connection with the nation state, and also cannot be anything other than the individual who is struggling to secure his civil and political rights, that I think creates, in that sense, a modern conception of refugee.
Patricia.
Thank you very much for your talk. One of the views, or one of the definitions of modernity that you explore is linked to a nation state. And you develop the argument that the refugee is modern because of the fact that they have to have left their nation state, they fall between the gaps and not accepted by another nation state, that's why they're modern. And on the same basis, you also develop the argument that Europe was once rooted in the concept of a nation state, and it reached a point where it now transcends that and has gone beyond that. Mm-hmm. And as such, you link the two together and you argue, well, the refugee remains modern as falling between these gaps, whereas Europe has somehow surpassed that, transcended that, moved beyond the nation state. But my argument is this: has Europe moved beyond the nation state? Right. Given that, for example, only a few months ago, Britain decided to opt out of a couple of recast directives. There's this tendency now, both in terms of immigration and economically, to move backwards from Europe, to actually take some powers back, and some people are calling for actually to come out of Europe. So how far is it true to say that Europe has transcended the nation-state paradigm when actually this moves towards actually pulling out of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll try and link my answer to perhaps a better attempt at the first answer, because I think underlying both is something I think I acknowledged at the beginning of the presentation, which is the difficulties and I think quite rightly the challenge to this, the way I'm using the concept of modern and postmodern, and insisting on those terms, and I acknowledge that they could be seen to be problematic. First, for the first point, I don't think I ever said the refugee is modern. I sort of did. What I wanted to emphasise is the way in which the refugee, in my example, but other figures historically, are made to be out of time. And that is, I think, the key point. Not they are out of time. Well, they are. I mean, if you're constructed as something, it's difficult to say you don't become it, but that they're out of time and out of place. Why then use modern and postmodern? No particular reason, certainly no reasons in terms of historical accuracy, except for what I think is one good reason, which is that it's sort of in the larger work, what I'm trying to do is to show how what is done with the refugee has some correspondences to the post-colonial histories that I'm talking about, and certainly within that history, whether accurately or not, the juxtaposition between the pre-modern and the modern was made. So I wonder whether the place characterising the shift is, I think, less significant. I mean, one has to do it because one has to use some terms to describe what one is attempting to capture. What I think is important, though, is that there is some attempted transition. And whether it's failed or not, or real or not, I'm not sure it's that significant. I mean, you could say that, that Europe was never modern. In fact, Bruno Latour does say we have never been modern. I mean, you could challenge that the modern world against the pre-modern world. I mean, that indeed we do now. That's what post-colonial theories do, and, precisely challenging the characterisation of certain indigenous groups as not there, not out of time, and so on. So I do think that there is a problem with the modern postmodern juxtaposition and where Europe is in that. What I don't buy, and I sort of started off being quite sympathetic with the sort of works that, and some with greater or lesser sophistication, that try to argue that actually the European Union isn't really much more than the nation state writ large or so on. I'm not entirely convinced about that. I think something significant and real and a real shift has happened. So in that sense, I think, I'm sort of with the more celebratory of the European Union scholars who sort of talk, in flourishing terms about the postmodern. I think there has been a shift, and I certainly don't think that the nation state has been buried. I always talk about the European Union being, it's still developing. But I think there has been a significant development. What I'm more interested in is how this seeming shift has occurred, how something that we may begin to question as being a real movement nevertheless appears to be a significant movement. And again, that's why I think that this sort of post-colonial is quite important. This is without much actual movement, how do you assert sovereignty over islands that were managed, that had a form of organisation, forms of law, forms of social being, and you transform those relatively, and without the conventional violence. I'm not saying that colonial acquisition wasn't violent, but certainly without that kind of conventional violence. And that's where the sort of migration aspect comes in. So I think I'm getting fairly close to answering your question. So I do think that there are difficulties with the story about Europe. I understand, yes, of course, in particular presenting this paper now, when Europe seems so unstable and, it's reminding us so much of the nation-state form, seems problematic. But on the other hand, you could say that actually, ultimately what I'm saying is Europe, what's important is not so much how Europe or the European Union looks, but what is behind its constituting. And in that sense, I'm essentially saying that the European Union has been developed in the way that other sovereigns were, through intensive, frenzied migration, which in that movement seems to put something in a new scene. And that's essentially what I'm saying. There's nothing new about that. But it's a process that presents a polity as seemingly novel, when in fact, when you unpick it, it perhaps isn't as unusual a configuration as possible. So just to go back to the refugee, because I know that I do think this is actually the part of the work that I struggle with, and the presentation of the refugee as modern and so on. But it is, what I'm really trying to say is that the refugee, that it's important for the refugee to be presented, I think, as being, out of time, as being less sophisticated, as being, disorganized, chaotic, or whatever, or struggling in some way. And which is why I do. I think I haven't explained it as well here, but in the larger text, and I don't have a copy with me, otherwise I would be able to find an indicative part. But which is why I do play around quite a bit with the idea of the refugee struggling to secure civil and political rights in a way that seems regressive within the European Union, and what that image of the refugee who is still struggling to secure rights that the rest of us, with the model citizens, are now feel were secure about, what that image presents.
But aren't they both part of the same project, arguably, of internationalisation, because both the Refugee Convention and the genesis of the European Community Union were roughly at the same time, after the Second World War, beginning of the 1950s. So actually, are they both part of different projects, or are they part of one project of internationalisation post-Second World War?
Yeah, but I think the coincidence is not a problem for the thesis as such. I mean, because the point is in anything in any project of invention or reinvention or revolution, the European Union, you could argue, I certainly would be inclined to see myself as pro-Europe as opposed to pro-European Union in comparison with the nation state. I mean, it is a modern project. There are problems with it, but there are lots of positive things, and I suspect a majority of people in Europe are not disadvantaged by it. That's a sweeping statement, but I'm making a statement to kind of make another one which is more significant, which is that, with most inventions, with most things new, that we manage to embrace most people within it. And what I'm interested in is those that cannot be embraced, and why they can't be, and why it's important that they're not embraced within that. And this is the argument that certain people, again in the sort of post-colonial, are not allowed to be modern. That I think within the European Union, there are people or groups that are not allowed to be whatever you call the European Union, let's call it postmodern. They're not permitted to be. Why are they not permitted? And I'm fixing on the refugee as that example, but others have written about other groups who would be perceived as Europe's others, and possibly more convincingly so. So that's, again, to take the Marlborough example, the indigenous group were there at the time. They could have been embraced and moved forward with the great Australian nation. Many probably did, but why were some not enough to be there?
Thank you very much. I think we've probably got time for one very short final question.
Well, I'll try and give a short answer this time.
Yes.
It's just a thought, really. But it seems also that we need to have excluded groups. Psychologically, as individuals and as nation states and as the postmodern, we still need these out groups, the other. And I think it's very hard to, because if the refugees integrated, there'll be somebody else. I feel.
Yeah. I think you could do, yes. And as I said, I'll just do. But I agree. And I think, in a sense, this is, in terms of a broader theory, which I've not touched upon, and there's very interesting work around that very question. Europe's other is well, the title Europe's other. But, and I don't think I could approach it from a psychoanalytical or other perspective. But in terms of the process of attaining identity, and the argument that that identity must to some extent be set against the other. In other words, that we know what we are simply by, through what we are not. That exclusion is essential. I think is a sort of broader theoretical frame within which I'm working.
Well, again, thank you very much, Patricia, for an excellent presentation. And I think one which has a lot of resonances with things that we've discussed in the course of the seminar series. Not least, I just wanted to end on one point which particularly struck me as you were talking, and responding to Parish's point, which is, it seems you talk a lot about migration and the role of inhabiting territory, and it's a point which is often made in probably one in the book, I expect. But the Dublin Convention, is one of those core aspects of the European Union, and it's something which doesn't allow free movement of refugees, in contradistinction to the free movement of citizens in those countries. So a lot of resonance as well with things that we've talked about in this series. So again, thank you very, very much, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Good evening to you all.